This is the place, and this is the time.
I remember years ago reading a book by a man named Stephen Burt called Fingerprints on the Chalice. And Stephen Burt said, when we sit down to eat with one another at the table, we meet at our most basic level of human need. We are most human. We recognize, although we don't always say it, our need for food. We recognize, although we don't always say it, our need for one another, human companionship. And we recognize, although we don't always say it, our need for God. Nobody does it on their own, right? There is a God, and we're not it. And when we sit down at the table, we recognize that we don't get through this world all on our own. If you think you did it on your own, if you're a self-made man or a self-made woman, I say, take a look at your belly button. That is an ever-present reminder that somebody else brought you into this world. I'm looking at Eliana's folks here caring for her right now, and I recognize that this beautiful child is also a helpless child, one who needs the care and the love of her parents, her extended family, her church family. Steve Burt says when we sit down at the table, more often than not, even if we don't name it, there's a kind of a deep level of knowing. We need food, we need each other, and we need God. And besides, he says it's hard to be anyone else but yourself when you're asking someone to pass the butter and you got ketchup dribbling down your chin. Welcome to the human race. You're a human being. It's not surprising, or at least it shouldn't be surprising to us people of faith, that after Jesus was raised from the dead, the risen Christ, as he made appearances in this world, quite often the risen Christ was revealed at the table. Sometimes that table might have been a campfire, a fish fry down on the beach when some of the disciples hauled in a net full of fish, so full they could barely drag it ashore. But they gathered and they saw something of the risen Christ. Sometimes people experience the risen Christ the way that elderly couple did in Luke's gospel today. There they were walking along that Emmaus road, and a stranger came upon them. And they talked about their faith. And he preached about the scriptures as they went along, and they still didn't recognize him. But then when they extended something of the hospitality in their hearts to this stranger on the road, this one who was virtually homeless, he had no place to go. He was going to keep walking through the night. They said, "Come and stay with us." And when they sat down at their table and he broke the bread before them, they glimpsed something of the risen Christ. Now, it shouldn't surprise us at all. It shouldn't surprise us at all that the risen Christ shows up at the table. Whether it's the table in our churches, which we've conveniently removed today. I was feeling a little disappointed. We needed to make room for our choir and some of this wonderful music today, and I thought, well, how's that going to work for an illustration for me today? And more importantly, it always gives me a sense of security. I feel like if I'm going to fall, the table will catch me. I haven't fallen yet. Relax, do not worry today. Your pastor is in good hands. It shouldn't surprise us that we meet Christ, the risen Christ, at the table in our churches, the table in our homes, and perhaps most importantly, the table in our hearts. You know, I was thinking about the table of my childhood. The table that my family and I gathered around night after night throughout my youth. It wasn't a spectacular table, but it was a little bit of an unusual table. It wasn't a Sears laminate. It wasn't a golden oak or a deep mahogany, the kind of dining room table that some young couples are known to receive as a wedding gift. A dining room set, perhaps. No, this was just a humble rectangle table. But perhaps what made it special, at least initially, is it was a table that was made by hands. It was made in love and faith by the hands of my father's best man, Pat. Pat had fashioned this table himself out of his own love, his own faith. And he said, I want to make you guys a family table so that I can be part of your lives too, and that, I might be part of your daily activities. And it was a little peculiar. It didn't have chairs. And I know you're thinking, well, was it a bar? We stood around it. No, it wasn't that either. It was a table that didn't have chairs, but had benches. These long benches, they could move in and out, but it kind of looked like a picnic table in our kitchen. And when we sat at that table, sometimes we felt a little bit like monks, huddled over our dinner at our long benches around this rectangle table. Now, I have to admit, as a kid, I used to feel a little bit embarrassed by our kitchen table. I was a little insecure as a teen. And if my friends came over to our house, quite often what happened is they'd walk through the door from the back porch, which walked straight into the kitchen, and we'd be talking, and they'd walk through that door, and they'd take one look at our kitchen table, and they'd say, "Hey, how come you got a picnic table in your kitchen?" As if being a preacher's kid wasn't bad enough, now I had to explain this picnic table in our kitchen. And admittedly, it probably wasn't the best material for a kitchen table. It was a very soft pine. Now that's fine for eating, but heaven forbid you ever drop something on the table, immediately there'd be a big dent in your table. And if you ever sat down at the table to do homework or perhaps to scribble a note on a piece of paper, Mom and Dad would come running into the kitchen saying, "Put something under that sheet of paper." Why? Because if you press too hard with your pen or your pencil on that sheet of paper, it'd go right through and press an indentation into your table. I remember one night my parents had gone out and they'd asked my brother Stephen, my older brother Stephen, and I to person the telephone. Dad was a preacher in a day and age long before cell phones or call forwarding or even answering machines. What he had was teenage kids. If anyone calls, take a message. Now my parents are out, and what do teenage kids do when Mom or Dad are out? Well, you get horsing around. We're horsing around in the kitchen and we're laughing. I can't even tell you what we were doing, but we were laughing so hard there were tears streaming down our cheeks. And guess what? That's when the phone rang. Now, if we had perhaps the wisdom of a few more years, we might have just said, let's not answer it. If it's important, they'll call back. But we didn't. And so in the middle of our laughter and the tears streaming down our faces, I picked up the phone and I said hello, and right away I could hear on the other end of the phone there was a woman who was very distraught. Well, I tried to act serious, but what happens when you're a teen and you're trying to be serious? It stresses you out and you laugh more. And my brother saw that I was laughing more, so he started poking me. He started making faces at me, and I continued to laugh, and I could hear this woman on the other end of the phone. She was so upset, now she's getting angry. All I could think to do was grab a sheet of paper from beside the phone, put it on the table, and write a note. Maybe if my brother saw the note, he'd leave me alone. I said, "Okay, tell me what to say." She said, "Just please tell your father that a man in the church has passed away. Just tell him Mr. Bruce died." And so I wrote this down, and I'm ashamed to say I was still laughing. I'm trying to this is embarrassing. And the more I felt embarrassed, the more I laughed. And I'm sticking the note in my brother's face. "Back off, Mr. Bruce died." Finally, at the end of the conversation, she said, "I don't think this is very funny. It's not a laughing matter." And I had to explain myself. I'm sorry. It's my big brother Steve's fault. He's here trying to make me laugh. We got forgiveness in the end. But what was astonishing is when my parents came home and took that note away, etched into the old skin of that kitchen table were the words, "Mr. Bruce died." And there those words stayed for many, many months and even years. Every time we sat down at the table, we remembered our laughter, we remembered the tears, the silliness, the kind of family silliness that happens in every home. Do you know, that table is the only place I ever saw my father break down and sob. It was the day that his friend Pat had called from Toronto to say that Pat's son, Mike, had been tragically killed in a skiing accident. My dad got off the phone, and I know he's just hanging on to my mother, and I could see his shoulders shrugging up and down, and could hear these great, heavy sobs, heaving sobs of grief and sadness right there at the kitchen table. It's a reminder to me that our tears of joy, our tears of laughter, and our tears of grief and our tears of sorrow, they meet at our kitchen tables, don't they? They meet there at the table. And maybe what's most important to us about our kitchen tables or the places we eat are the people we break bread with at the table. It's the people we remember around our tables. My brothers and I always doing something at the table. I remember our arguments at the table. I remember my brother David shoving me so hard once that I fell backwards onto the table. We heard a huge crack. We thought, oh no, we've broken the table. And ironically, we were relieved to figure out it was just my back. Our kitchen table is where family gathers and friends gather. The kitchen table was the place I brought my new girlfriend one day to become my beloved, my very special best friend, Beth, for the first time to that kitchen table. And if you can imagine these big, loud Giuliano boys and their parents and my brothers and their girlfriends, it's a loud place. We're loud people, these Giulianos. It's no wonder God called us to be preachers. My brother Stephen looks across the table at me and my beautiful girlfriend Beth beside me, and he says, "Hey Mark, it seems like your girlfriend seems very nice if she said anything." And Beth said, she said, "Oh, I might say something if I could get a word in edgewise." Right then and right there, I knew this was a keeper. If she could silence my brother Steve at the kitchen table, she was definitely a keeper. The kitchen table is where family and friends gathered. At Christmas time, it's where my brothers and I would take the cutting board and put walnuts down and try and crack walnuts with our heads. We did have the cutting board, so we didn't put an indentation into the table. Do you know, the day that Pat brought our kitchen table to our house, he'd borrowed somebody's van and he put the table that he'd made in his basement into that van. He drove 4 hours from Toronto down to Windsor, where we were living at the time. And he brought this table in two pieces into our kitchen, the framework and then the tabletop. And he brought the framework in first. And I couldn't help but notice that at each end of the framework, he had carved a cross out of wood. And he'd affixed it to the end of the table with some sort of wood glue, and he'd shellacked it or varnished it into the table so it looked like it was really carved into the table. Now, when the tabletop went on top of the table, you couldn't see the cross very easily unless you stepped away from the table and it could look at it that way. You could, well, there's a cross under that table. Or maybe if you were sitting at the table someday, you could bend over, when you could bend like that, and you could see the cross under the table. It was interesting, we didn't talk about the cross being there all the time, but I think in our family we were acutely aware that the cross was there. It was a reminder to us that our table was somehow a holy space, a sacred space. That whenever we sat down at the table, there was something of the presence of God in our midst. Whether we said it or not, whether we acknowledged it or not, we knew that that table was a place of blessing, a place of abundant grace, a place where we might experience a glimpse of the risen Christ. It was a place where strangers were welcomed so often to our table, and sometimes begrudgingly by teenage boys. We'd go to church on Sunday, and if there was a wayward traveler, if there was someone who had nobody, they were coming home with us. Did you grow up in one of those houses where mom had something in the oven cooking through church? And then the 70s, we had the crock pot. That was like a way to keep things going, so that the table would always have enough food for strangers along the way. And whether I liked it at first or not, my parents said, "You will sit and you will eat with us." And I'm like, I want to go play street hockey. I want to go play pickup football in the side yard. But as I sat with these strangers, widows and widowers in our congregation who didn't have anybody, or people who were just passing through, I got to experience something much richer than I might with my friends just out on the street. I got to experience something of God, something of what it is to extend hospitality at your own table and know the blessings of extending hospitality. What a joy. It was around that table that some of my own friends who'd been tough loved out of their own homes found welcome. Remember tough love? You just kick them out of the house. That was our parenting strategy in the 1970s. Tough loved right out of the house. They often showed up at our table. My dad was the pastor, and so we'd sit there and say, come on, you got to talk to my dad. He'll help you. It was around that table we worked that stuff out. It was around that table that one of my friends, a teenage girl from our congregation who had found herself pregnant, very upset, very troubled, as you can imagine, and she didn't know how to tell her parents. Where did she come? To the kitchen table. That's where you found support. That's where you found love. That's where you found the miracle of the risen Christ bringing hope and promise. You know, I don't know if you've noticed that anywhere you go in the world, anywhere, if you go into a Christian church, there's going to be a table. If you're looking for ours today, it's just outside this door. And one of the things that makes me feel so good about the Old Stone Church is we celebrate the sacrament of Holy Communion not just once a quarter or the first Sunday of each month. We celebrate the sacrament of Holy Communion every Sunday, if not in this room, in the chapel. It's a reminder to us that at the table we meet the risen Christ. What a blessing. And if you go into some of these churches around the world and take a look at their tables, they're probably a lot like the table that was in my kitchen when I was growing up. They've got words etched into the old tables. Sometimes the words are a scripture reading. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only son. Or maybe it says, do this in remembrance of me. It's around those tables that us church families, the body of Christ, we do just what our families do. We argue and we fight and we work out our troubles and our crisis. We bring it here before God to the table. And when we take that risk of bringing our heartache and our grief and our joy and our silliness, oh my gosh. Just a month or so ago, I remember us serving communion in here and we didn't quite get it right. I don't know who got served in the wrong order, but what a joy to laugh about it. What a joy to be in Christian family and know that it's okay. The grace of God is big enough to handle our little faux pas in the sanctuary on a Sunday morning. That's what the table is all about in the Christian church. But you know, the table is not just a physical place in the church. The table's really located in our hearts, isn't it? The kind of welcome we bring to strangers we meet along the way, it's located here in our hearts. The kind of welcome we bring to one another in the sanctuary, the hand stretching out across the aisle to say welcome, even if you don't recognize that person. It begins here at the table in our own hearts. After worship, you can go in and celebrate the sacrament of Holy Communion in the chapel, or you can come downstairs and enjoy an incredible time of fellowship around our coffee tables. I know it's a big discussion in the Old Stone Church. Just how extravagant should our coffee hour be? Or how extravagant shouldn't it be? What's the proper welcome? And what's enough and what's not enough? But all the issues about abundance and grace, they're worked out at that table downstairs too, aren't they? Not because the table is laden with goodies, but because there's things going on in our hearts. I was talking to somebody recently and he said, sometimes we struggle at Old Stone. We see some people, they take a plate full of food and they just keep piling stuff on. And I feel like that's too much. Why are they taking so much? My thought was, well, if somebody's hungry, let them take as much as they need. This is a place of abundance, abundant grace, abundant food. We've got it all. But then this person said something very wise to me. He said, the real issue isn't out here with that person and how much they're taking. He said, the real issue's in here with me. Why am I feeling so upset by this? Why am I struggling? Why am I offended by this? Maybe the real issue's here in my heart and I need to work on my heart. Wasn't the story of the couple who met this stranger on the Emmaus road a story for us today? A story about how this elderly married couple welcomed this stranger from the road into their house, invited him to their table, and when they broke bread together, they caught a glimpse of the risen Christ. Maybe when the heart's in the right place, when the table of our heart is prepared in the right way, we bring an incredible welcome to strangers. We start living out of the abundance of God's grace within us, the abundance of God's forgiveness and mercy that each and every one of us has received through Jesus Christ. We set the table and welcome one another, and when we do, we catch a glimpse of Christ's truth, of Christ's mercy, of Christ's love for each and every one of us. Do you know, in the year 2000, my beloved Beth and I moved our children and ourselves down to Savannah, Georgia. We didn't have much to take with us, but when we arrived, we said, we got to go get a kitchen table. We've got no place for the kids to eat, no place for us to sit down as a family. And we went around looking at all the usual places, trying to find a kitchen table, and we ended up at Pier 1. We said, they get some unusual stuff at Pier 1. Let's take a look. And we walked through the front doors of Pier 1, and were immediately stopped in our tracks. You know what we saw? A very simple, very humble rectangle table with 2 long benches. We knew right away we'd found our kitchen table. We brought that table home, set it up in our kitchen. It took me back to my youth, and it held out for me the promise of God's grace in the midst of our family, in the midst of our kitchen. It was less than a week that had passed, and I was working in the next room. And my son Dylan, who might have been 12 or 13 at the time, he came walking in the back door with a friend of his, Vincent. And they're goofing around in the kitchen the way my brothers and I used to. I could hear them searching through the fridge, looking for something to eat, and they were laughing about something. And all of a sudden it got very quiet. And I heard Vincent say, "Hey, Dylan, how come you have a picnic table in your kitchen?" Friends, when we sit down at the table, whether it's the table in our kitchens, whether it's the table in our sanctuaries, or whether it's the table of God's grace and mercy in our hearts, we meet at the most basic level of our human need. The need for good bread, the need for one another, and the need for God. And when we can invite others to join us at that table, when we can extend hospitality out of the abundance of God's grace at this table in our hearts, that's when we experience the risen Christ in our world. Praise be to God. Amen.
This is the time.
This is the time.
This is the place.
Hallelujah.
This is the time.